Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. It's episode 161. We're going to be talking about Unpkg today with Michael Jackson, open source extraordinaire, now entrepreneur extraordinaire. And so we're really excited to dive into Unpkg and learn about all the cool things that are new with it. Before we get into that, I will pass it over to tell us what's new in the web this week.
Thank you, Amal. So first of all, React version 16.4.0 has just been released, which includes support for pointer events and has various bug fixes. A pull request for an initial implementation of workers for threading support in Node has just been published, and the review process looks to be going pretty well. A new open source project called, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Vuido has just been released, which allows you to create native Windows OS X and Linux desktop applications with Vue.js, and there's no dependency on Electron there. Great news that the Shadow DOM has just been activated in Firefox nightly, so it's great to see their implementation coming along nicely and hope to see that in stable soon. Safari Technology Preview 57 has just been made available, which includes a ton of fixes and improvements and also drop support for Mac OS Sierra. And finally, Chrome 67 has just hit the stable channel with a wide range of fixes, improvements and security updates. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Back over to you, Amal.
Oh, awesome. Glad to know the web's still working, Justin.
We try to keep it working. That's 95% of my job. It's 5% of Danny's job, I think. Is that about right, Danny? Something like that? You take the 5% of the weekends?
That's pretty much it. I do what I can.
We take turns, people. So we're really excited for our guest today, Michael Jackson, and we are going to be talking about Unpkg. And so welcome, Michael.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I know now who to contact the next time the internet is broken. I'll just ping Justin and Danny, right?
That's the way to go, yes.
That is actually correct. If anybody wants Justin's direct contact information, just let us know, and you know who to complain to.
Yes, I solve all internet problems.
Justin at theinternet.com.
Yes, we'll let you know where to send your ravens, since that's what we'll be using when the internet goes down.
I feel like that's a good way to go. Yes, spot on.
So Michael, so for those of you who don't, for those who, I guess are not familiar with your really long history in the open source community, could you kind of tell us a little bit about how you got started? I know quite a few people actually don't know that you are like behind some really cool projects like handlebars. I mean, there's a lot of things that you've kind of created that have taken off like wildfire. And so for me, you're kind of like this interesting synergy of like, OSS entrepreneur, as I called it, because, it seems like everything you touch kind of just like, gets really popular really fast.
Well, for sure. Thank you, Amal. So I didn't work on handlebars directly, but kind of indirectly through my work on Mustache, which was kind of like a predecessor to handlebars. But the one grew out of the other. So you could say I did. But that was actually a project. So I worked on Mustache.js when I was at Twitter it was around like 2011, 2012. We were doing all of our client-side stuff at Twitter in using these Mustache templates, which for those of you who may not have heard of the term Mustache before, or handlebars, it's basically the way that it was originally built was logicless templates. And then quickly the logic worked its way back into the templates, because I think that taking all of the logic out of your templates I think a lot of people felt kind of limited by that. But that was the way that it was originally introduced. It was actually, Mustache was originally a thing that was introduced by the people at GitHub, who were like, I've got all this logic in my templates. I don't really want the logic in my templates. I just want it, I just want to have these little variables basically that I can intersperse in my template So yeah, that was something that I did a lot of work on. And then handlebars is kind of like the evolution of all of the work on Mustache, and it's kind of like all of the logic is right back into your template. So we've come full circle with Mustache and handlebars. A couple of other things that I worked on before. So one thing that I worked on a long time ago that some people still know me for actually was in 2008, I released a thing called Shadowbox, which was, if you've been doing web programming for probably about a decade now, you might have used Shadowbox. That was kind of one of the original light boxes for the web. Now, of course, you see them all over the place. Whenever you go to your favorite website, they immediately show you a modal. So I guess maybe you have me to kind of indirectly blame for that. But that's all old stuff. The stuff that I mainly work on these days is I do a lot of work in React. So I run a company doing training in React at reacttraining.com. And then I as part of that, I work on React Router. I work on the history NPM package, which is one that people use for doing in-page navigation in the React apps. And then, of course, the thing that we're talking about today, which is Unpkg. So Unpkg is it's this project that kind of grew out of the router project. Actually, we had a need to publish our UMD builds, right? People wanted to be able to basically just drop a script tag on the page and use React Router. And I was going to publish it to CDN.js, but that required me setting up like a separate thing. And I was thinking, we're just publishing these UMD builds to NPM anyway. How hard would it be to basically build a reverse proxy in front of NPM, and then basically the only thing that the proxy does is it can just it does more than this, but the main thing it does is it pulls down tarballs from NPM and decompresses them, and then just serves up files from inside them. So that's the project, and kind of the essence of Unpkg is anything that's on NPM, you can now get it on a fast, globally available CDN that's actually backed by Cloudflare. So that's kind of cool.
I like that you originally had the reason you didn't want to put it on an existing service was, I got to do this whole separate thing. I'll just build my own. That's fine.
Yeah, I know, it's silly, isn't it? The thing I was, I'm a tinkerer and I'm a maker, at heart, and so yeah, definitely building my own was a lot more work than probably just making this config thing for CDN.js. The thing was actually is I actually I tried in my defense. I tried making pull requests to CDN.js, and they were rejected for some reason. Like I think I had made like some syntax error or something that they wanted me to fix. And I guess you could say I kind of have a low tolerance level for people kind of nitpicking my code. And so I was like, screw it, I'm going to build a reverse proxy. And I had some extra time on the plane, and so that's what I did.
I like it.
Yeah, so that's like a really cool story into how Unpkg got started. I think proxies are on the client are just highly like underrated. I see a lot of like front end developers struggle with like getting their back end builds to work, and I'm just like, just make a little proxy. You don't even have to build anything. Just like make a little proxy, like work on a production or staging database. Like it doesn't actually matter, and so people don't leverage that enough. So I think it's cool that you kind of solve this problem in a way that actually scales, because you're still leveraging NPM. You're just kind of this very thin wrapper on top of that. It's really smart. I'm
jealous you wrote it on a plane. Like I'm never that productive on a plane. Like, how do you?
Yeah.
Where's the focus there? Your focus is laser, Michael.
Yeah,
that's my takeaway from this so far. I'm just sorry.
I'm trying to cram in movies. I'm just trying to how many free movies can I watch in 95 minutes? So
I think it must have been like a Southwest flight, so I didn't have a screen in front of me. So I was like, okay, what am I going to do? But to your point about proxies, Amal, I think it is really interesting. I think you're right on, because if we even look at a couple of other like really popular technologies nowadays, a lot of them are kind of built in that fashion. A couple of examples, right? So a lot of companies are even, using Node.js as a kind of a proxy, right? They've maybe got their original sort of backend that's written in who knows what, Python or Perl or PHP or whatever. And then they use Node.js to kind of stitch together a lot of these sort of backend services. So they basically use Node as kind of a proxy server. GraphQL, which is another kind of popular technology, which is on the rise these days, is also kind of a proxy for like your data, right? Like you could have a bunch of different services that return data. GraphQL just kind of sits in front of them, returns a bunch of, and kind of aggregates the data. On the client side specifically, we have why is it escaping me right now? Not web workers.
Service workers are client-side proxies.
Thank you. Yes, service workers. Absolutely. That was what I was reaching for. The service workers is, you can fetch and then you can cache stuff. So I think, I think it's a really, really smart approach. And with the distributed nature of the web makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, you hit the mark. I mean, I think, with, distributed systems, I mean, you can't really do anything without leveraging proxying, especially for like before you hit production, right? All of the internal testing. But actually, I wanted to step back before we get too far into Unpkg. You touched on UMDs, and so for our listeners who might not be familiar with what UMDs are, can you spell out the acronym? I know what they are. Just
Sure.
Universal module definitions. But could you tell us what they are and kind of also what the story is behind UMDs, because that's the kind of meat of Unpkg.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're, so UMD means universal module definition, right? And so, if you're new to JavaScript, you might actually be surprised to know that modules are kind of a relatively new thing in JavaScript. Relatively new because JavaScript has existed since the 90s, and we just, modules just started being mainstream maybe in the last couple of years. And before JavaScript modules were actually a thing, we had to sort of figure out different ways to sort of fake it, I guess. And so one of those ways was called CommonJS. CommonJS is, it's the require statement. If you've ever done any programming in Node, you'd be familiar with CommonJS. You basically, the modules are your files, and then you have a function, a global function called require, and you can go and grab the code in that file where you can export all kinds of stuff. So it's a really, really great method for encapsulating your code. The question is, okay, how do we take code that we write in that style and actually run it in a browser where we don't have this global require function? So the answer to that for many people, and even still today for many people, is to bundle your code. So they'll take a look at code that they've written in either CommonJS, or maybe you're even using sort of a modern ES module syntax like the import and the export statements. Maybe you're even using that via a compiler like Babel. In any case, you want to compile that to a format that browsers sort of universally understand. And there was another one, AMD, right? Asynchronous module definition. And so UMD, I think, was basically a way to say, look, we've got all these different sort of competing module formats. We're not sure which one could win or whatever. Let's just make one that's kind of like universal. And then you could, as an author, you could author your code in whatever module format you want. And then you could sort of bundle it up. And a UMD is interesting because you could actually use it in Node. Or you could take that bundle and you could actually just, use it in the browser. Like maybe you attach your library to a global, like window.jQuery equals, this immediately, what do they call it? An immediately invoking function, whatever thing that basically is your UMD bundle. And so, it's a very, very common solution for people who just want to take a JavaScript library. They want to bundle it up. They're not quite sure where people are going to use it. They want the freedom to author it in whatever module format they want. And so they compile it down to a UMD build and just give you that. And a lot of big JavaScript libraries do it today. Obviously, we do it in React Router, I already mentioned, but the React core team as well publishes UMD build as well as a common JS build, and a lot of other JavaScript libraries do the same thing.
Thank you for that super in-depth explanation. And without going too far into modules, can we kind of discuss how ES6 modules, and now that modules are becoming a standard in the JavaScript language, how does this change things for the UMD world?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because I feel like we're kind of at an inflection point, and let me explain a little bit of what I mean by that. So ES modules are now like the thing, right? We have all sort of argued about it for the last couple of years, and the JavaScript modules have now been standardized and made it into ECMAScript, the spec, right? So whatever other ways to define your modules, whether you were using AMD or whether you were using CommonJS, we've all sort of agreed that ES modules should be the thing moving forward. There is still, I think personally, a very strong case for using CommonJS if you're only targeting Node. But if you're going to target any other platform, you really should just be just using ES modules. So what that means for these other formats is, you could continue to author in those other formats. It's just just know that if you're doing something like an open source project and you're publishing it for a lot of other people to use, you're probably gonna have to provide a UMD build, or at least a common JS build for people who want to, for example, if they're using a bundler like a Webpack or Browserify or something that understands CommonJS, then they could bundle it themselves into whatever format they want. But it basically means if you're using one of these other formats, it's time to kind of, it's time to transition onto using ES modules. And one of the things that I think are really really great about the ES module spec itself is that it's actually very it's a static way to define your modules and your dependencies, as opposed to like CommonJS, which was a dynamic way, right? You could, because require was a function call, you could really put whatever you wanted inside that function call. You could have a ternary expression, or you could have do some string concatenation and give basically a dynamic module name to require. That's not how these ES modules work at all. Everything is very statically defined, which in theory should make it easier for tools like compilers and optimizers to take a look at your code, if you have these statically defined dependencies, and make some decisions about, how to optimize that stuff or how to compile it down for different formats. But yeah, it basically means for these other formats that they're going away. But like I said, I personally still feel like there's a very, very, very strong argument for using CommonJS on Node, although people are using ES modules on Node. I think, just because of the way that the ecosystem was built over the last, golly, how old is Node now? I mean, maybe 8 or 9 years. Just because of the way that the ecosystem was built over that period of time, there's so much existing code that uses CommonJS that I think that you could make a very strong argument for using CommonJS on Node. But everywhere else you're using ES modules, and like I said, these UMDs are especially useful if, for example, you just want to drop a script tag on the page, because most browsers don't actually support ES modules yet. I think Chrome does, and I think actually Canary Safari does. But I don't actually, I'm not currently up to date as to which browsers use ES modules or not, but it's very sort of cutting edge for a lot of them.
Yeah. We can drop a link to the browser support for that spec. I'm also happy to report, Michael, that there is a new proposal that's actually in stage 3, so it's fairly promising for dynamic modules. Use import kind of close parentheses, so it would give us that kind of dynamic ability to load in things just like we have in Common.js. So
of course, how could I have forgotten about that? Yeah, absolutely, yeah, you're right. Yeah,
it's really exciting. No, it's a super. I mean, it's very exciting. And I'm like you that I think the Node community has had a really good solution for a very long time. And it's kind of why switch, but if you don't have to, but anyways, standards are good, right?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's funny though how given especially what you just said, how we've kind of like we feel like we've moved forward, and then fine, here's this import function that basically lets you do everything that require used to let you do. So it's like I don't know. I feel like that's kind of the way the web evolves generally. Like we would like to build an ivory tower and make everything sort of perfect, and but in the end it really is just lots and lots of people build up things that work, and then you build infrastructure on top of that, and then it's hard to move forward, but in the same time, like I think that's kind of a beautiful part of the web. Like it's human. Right. And it's like sometimes when I look at the spelling of the referrer header, for example, I just chuckle because I think, yeah, this is a human thing. It's not an ivory tower. It's an imperfect, flawed thing. And it's got all sorts of little, things in the spec. I mean, heck, when's the last time, and anybody read the HTML spec? I mean, that thing is I think a perfect example of like, it's got loads of stuff for being backwards compatible. JavaScript itself is backwards compatible to I think probably to the beginning. So yeah, we preserve support for old things, and then we try and make new shiny things that are kind of based on what we learned from those things. But this is maybe how we think we should have done it. Okay, fine, we'll preserve support for the old thing as well.
Awesome. So we've talked about modules, which is one important part of Unpkg. The other thing you mentioned briefly, which is CDN. Can you just briefly explain what a CDN is and why? Because a lot of people have probably used them or used links. A lot of people have probably used links from Unpkg and just don't really think about it. Just copy and paste into your file. But can you explain what it is and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So a CDN stands for Content Distribution Network, or Content Delivery Network. Maybe I'm not sure. When we shorten these things, I forget the words behind them, but. One of those. Anyway, the idea is that you running your app in a certain data center somewhere. You're in a certain geographical location, and somebody else using your app on the other side of the world. For them, the latency is much greater to actually get the files that they need to actually use your app. And a lot of this stuff, honestly. In your app these days, it's not, their request that they're making from the other side of the world probably doesn't even need to hit your server. Maybe it's just CSS files or JavaScript files or static HTML files, stuff that you can build ahead of time, at build time. And then you can serve those files much more quickly if you cached them on a server that was a lot closer to them, geographically speaking. So, if you're publishing an app, maybe some of the requests need to go to your server, but a lot of these requests can just be served from a global content delivery network. And so, there have been a couple of companies, a couple of big companies built up these days. It used to be a technology or a technique that was just used by, very, very large enterprise type customers. Akamai, what I think was one of the original kind of big players in the space, where if you were a very large company, you had the money to pay for this infrastructure. If you were a Netflix, you would go and buy servers all over the world, and you basically create your own content delivery network. Well, now this sort of thing has been commoditized. So even little me building my app, I can actually leverage the power of a content delivery network and get these static files to people wherever they might be in the world a lot more quickly. So some of the popular alternatives now are, Cloudflare, as I said, already sponsors Unpkg. They do a tremendous amount of traffic, and they do a tremendous job. I can't speak highly enough about Cloudflare. Other alternatives might be, Key CDN, Fastly. There are loads and loads and loads of CDNs out there. And they compete based, on different features and stuff. But that's basically what a CDN is and why it's important. Obviously, the huge power in a CDN comes from caching. So if you can, if you can put the longer sort of caching lifetime that you can put on your resource, the greater chance it is that when somebody hits your website, that they're already going to have that resource cached in their browser. So lots of build tools, in fact, these days are actually optimized for caching. So, for example, if you're using Webpack in your build, you can insert the hash of the file name. So basically, a content hash into the actual file name, so that a browser, or an HTTP proxy, which there are varying degrees of conforming to the spec, but an HTTP proxy can actually just look at the URL and say, hey, this URL, because it has the hash in it, is exactly the same as the URL, and we know that because it's got the exact same hash, we're going to get the exact same content. So don't even bother fetching that data from the server again. So caching happens at lots and lots of different levels, right? It can happen at the CDN level, but it can also just happen right there in your browser. Your browser maintains a cache of all the stuff that it's downloaded.
That's awesome. I think that's a very good explanation because I also think a lot of people use them because they're told to, right? Not necessarily because they know why. So I think it's important to get to that, which again brings us kind of full circle back to Unpkg. So I know early on when I first started doing a lot of dev stuff, I don't know if I really remember Node not fully being around, but it was always just server side stuff. And it's actually been within the last just few years that it's really taken off as the package manager for front end work as well. Because I know for a long time you would use npm for your server stuff, and you'd use Bower or something like that for your front end code. Mm-hmm. So did you see this becoming something that you're like, oh, I think every npm package that is runnable on the front end should be available, should automatically be available through some sort of CDN without any setup? Was that the main goal, or was it not, or was it just like, oh, we have to solve this one problem that you were saying, this particular problem that with the React project?
That's a great question, Danny. I'm glad you asked that because a lot of people, obviously npm grew out of the need for the Node ecosystem to have a package manager for Node. And at a certain point, I think a lot of people looked at it and thought, well, that's just for Node, but we would like to be able to publish, sharing code is an incredibly valuable way for an ecosystem to grow. I personally believe that the Node ecosystem wouldn't be half of what it is today if it weren't for npm. Node was a huge innovation, but npm itself was a huge boost, gave a huge boost to the Node community, because now I don't have to write all of my Node code myself. I can just grab some code from you or from the open source community and use it in my app. So, when it came time for the front end community, which tend to be kind of, two different communities, the majority of front end developers don't really do a whole lot on the back end, although a lot do. So, but anyway, when the front end community, kind of looked at Node in the early days, and this is, maybe just 5 or 6 years ago, people would look at Node and say, well, that's the package manager for Node, but we're front-end developers and we're not really doing stuff on Node. So maybe we need something else, right? Maybe we need a Bower, or maybe we need a require JS, or what was the other one? There was I'm blanking right now, but there were a couple of solutions for doing basically modules on the client side and basically sharing code, right? These things are very, very closely related. And I actually remember doing some Ember development back in the day. This was probably 4 or 5 years ago now, and it was not. And I'm not trying to knock Ember at all, but it was not obvious to me as somebody who was, I had done a lot of Node. I had done some front end, but it was a period in my career where I was doing more on the back end. I was doing more like infrastructure type work. And I went to the client side and I wanted to like piece together things like I had done in my Node app. And it wasn't incredibly obvious to me how to get that done. And it might kind of blow your mind if you're listening to this podcast now, because so much front end code is on NPM now, and it's so easy to just be like, yeah, I'm just going to NPM install whatever module, and then I can use it in my front end app. But that really was not the case just a couple of years ago. You would want to use a JavaScript file in your front end app, and you would npm install something, and maybe it was only built for Node, and so it had a require statement in there, and they weren't compiling it. So when you tried to include it in your client side bundle or your client side app, it would break everything, and so this honestly was a huge problem for front end development, for front end developers to share code. And it wasn't until I started using React that I think the React community and the React developers themselves really, they just said, look, we're developing a library. We are not developing a system for sharing modules. We're not developing, a system for sharing code. We certainly aren't interested in developing a package manager. So let's just publish the React library to NPM. And nowadays, again, that seems like a really obvious choice, right? But just a couple of years ago, it wasn't long ago, that felt kind of weird, right? Like you might have like npm installed jQuery before that, but that felt really weird too. And so when React made that decision, now they said, look, everybody, if you want to use React in your app, you can either use this global script tag, where we publish our UMD build, or if you're using a bundler like Webpack or something on the back end, or Browserify, you can just npm install React, and you can incorporate it into part of your build. So this was kind of a huge shift in how we thought about it. And for me personally, it was incredibly refreshing, because as I said, I was coming from this place where it wasn't obvious how to consume the code. And what's more is I actually wanted to participate, right? Because I am kind of an open source guy. So I wanted to publish code for other Ember developers to use. And so to share code and to consume code, from my perspective at that point in time, was not obvious at all. How do I do this? Can I npm install it? Or if I can't, then what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to publish UMD builds? And then people are going to consume that. Well, what can I assume about what they're running on their platform? Anyway, it was, and so when React kind of said, look, we're just going to publish to NPM, and the whole React community kind of followed suit, right? So we published React Router to npm, and they published Redux to npm, and now all of a sudden it was like, okay, so whatever is published to npm isn't just Node stuff. It's stuff for Node, sure, but it's also, the front end community is leveraging this thing as kind of their package manager as well. And I think npm Inc. actually picked up on this trend recently, just in the last couple of years. And I think they've been looking at the numbers of people who are using npm, and they've realized that, the front end community dwarfs the Node community. You might think the Node community is large, and it is, but the front end community is absolutely global scale, and it absolutely dwarfs the Node community. It's probably 10 times the size, and so you're seeing like a massive increase in the usage of npm these days, because it's not just Node developers using npm anymore. It's Python Django developers, and it's PHP developers, and Ruby developers, and Java developers are all building their front ends using npm as the package manager for their front end, even though they still have, Maven and Bundler, Ruby Bundler, and all these other package managers for the back end, and pip. For the front end code, everybody's using npm because JavaScript as a whole, the front end ecosystem said, hey, we need a package manager. Let's just do it on npm. And like I said, for me personally, the React team was the one who kind of led that charge. And it was, can I just tell you how refreshing it was? I mean, just how amazingly liberating and enabling that was, to have a way to publish code and to consume code without wondering about like, oh, what module format are they using, and what or is this just for Node, or is it for the browser too? It was incredibly refreshing. I actually published an article a couple of years back where I was trying to kind of get at this idea. I coined a term called universal JavaScript, where previously the term that had kind of been thrown around was this idea of isomorphic JavaScript. And I when I started doing this and I started using npm for my front end code, I was like, does it really matter where this JavaScript code runs anymore? I mean, people are using it on React Native. People are using it in React in the browser. People are using it, to render React server side in their Node apps. And who knows where JavaScript is going to run, in future days. I mean, one of the users of React Router, Netflix, was actually using it in their own custom renderer that they use to run Netflix on televisions, right? So we can't predict the future of JavaScript, where it's going to run. It's at this point, it's absolutely huge, and people are just going to keep making it run in more and more places. I wouldn't be surprised if we're building, Apple Watch apps in JavaScript, or other similar kinds of things. If I'm programming my thermostat in JavaScript in a couple of years, and so this idea that JavaScript really is when you publish JavaScript and when you consume JavaScript, that it really is universal. JavaScript that is built to run on any given runtime. Because you can't predict all the ways that people are going to use it.
Wow, Michael, that was like a very inspirational monologue from you on web history. It's just I follow up on a couple of points that you made. So one, I completely agree. Like, it's so it's not mentally taxing to think about to make a decision on where to publish your modules anymore, right? Because previously it was like a decision that people had to actively make, and it was a step in the step towards productionizing, right? And so that's kind of gone. Secondly, this this brave new world of publishing to one place for both ecosystems. I mean, it's kind of duh, right? It's like, how come we didn't do this to begin with? But I'm really glad that we did.
Uh-huh.
And lastly, you mentioned something around this invisible shift that happened, right, when React and all these other big projects started adopting npm. But I think the unsung hero there, which made this shift invisible for most people, were bundlers, right? Because without bundlers, there's no way to it wouldn't have been as easy to use npm.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you to all the bundle authors bundle authors out there.
For sure. That was a huge part of it, right? I remember actually just in 2012, here I was working at Twitter, which, high tech company, San Francisco, and we were literally using cat as our bundler. We would just say, look, here are all the JavaScript files that we need, and let's create a big list, and don't mess up the order because, oh my gosh, these are all globals. so watch out here. Be very careful with the ordering here. And then when it came time to build for the front end, it was just cat that file and append this other file and append this other file and append this other file, and that's it. And then the bundlers came along and were like, hey, they let us think in modules now instead of globals. So yeah, absolutely, the bundlers were a huge part of this, Browserify and Webpack.
Yeah, I have to also wonder though, with this kind of invisible shift, right? As developers are now using, as front-end developers are using npm, that's kind of, it felt like the beginning of when people's bundle sizes started to go crazy, right? And so previously you would see like 100 lines in like, I don't know, the beginning of somebody's index file, and now it's maybe just a few because everybody's bundling this, all of their dependencies into this one thing. And so I feel like that's kind of another interesting tipping point for web development history,
Oh, for sure. Like I think there are a lot of people now, like, the bundler has bundled up your file and you take a look at it and now you're like, what's in here again? You've kind of lost a little bit of a handle on it. You used to be able to look at the top of your HTML file and see all the script tags and you understood, okay, I'm importing React, etc. And now you're just importing, some file with a hash .js, and you're like, okay, so what's in that thing? And I think I think there's definitely a future for, optimizing it and taking a look at this. In particular, like Webpack has done a lot of work with code splitting, and Parcel is actually another bundler that I've been impressed with recently. That they put a lot of great work into that. But anyway, the idea of taking this bundle, splitting it into different different pieces that we can just sort of load on demand, and then also just kind of, I think there's some work to be done in the area of just understanding these bundles and being able to sort of inspect them and see what's going on. I mean, there's a bug right now on one of my sites where I had to just yesterday. I had to make the sort of non-optimized for production build, Webpack build, which was, maybe 30,000 lines, hadn't been minified or anything yet. And I had to go looking through there by hand to see like, okay, what is actually going on here? And it turns out that, some things were going on in the bundle. And this was, again, it wasn't a problem with my code. It was, we had misconfigured the bundler without realizing it, and so inadvertently sort of broken the app. But yeah, it's these bundles do sort of introduce a new level of opaqueness, right? They're kind of like a black box sometimes, and I think there's a lot of work to do with going in and understanding what we're actually loading on the page. Unpkg specifically is kind of a refreshing sort of alternative in that sense, right? So Unpkg is actually really popular with a lot of people who are doing things like code pens and JS fiddles and code sandbox, because it does kind of take them back to script tags, right? And so one of the primary ways to use Unpkg today is if you just, the URL structure is actually very, very clean. And so you just say something like unpkg.com/React. And you could have a script tag, in your code pen or in your code sandbox, and say, source equals https unpkg.com/React, and you will get a global build of React on the page, which is awesome. Or many other libraries do that as well. Unpkg.com/jQuery, unpkg.com/3 to get 3JS or Lodash or whatever you want, and And that's not opaque, right? That's actually very clear. You can sort of look up at the top of your HTML file and scan through the script tags, and you can understand exactly what you're putting on the page, which I think is kind of it's not optimized like the bundlers optimize your stuff, but it is kind of refreshing, right? It's kind of interesting to be able to kind of go back, and it's almost kind of nostalgic for me personally to just kind of go back, take a step back a little bit and say, look, we went all the way down this bundler rabbit hole, which was good, right? The bundler gave us a lot of things. Could we maybe come back up out of the hole and maybe use some of these kind of practices that we used to use that provided us greater understanding of what was actually going on, knowing what we know now, having gone down the hole. So for example, using modules, right, on the client. Is there, and this is an active area of research for me on Unpkg, is there a compelling use case for a globally, cached module? So for example, could I load, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, could I load my library? Could I load React, for example? Say I'm a React developer. Could I load that from Unpkg and cache things at the module level? And then maybe they fix like a bug in React and it only touches, one or two files. But if I'm caching at the module level, could I just download those one or two files and still have 95% of React already cached on my machine? Anyway, I'm kind of going down my other rabbit hole now, but it's just areas of thought and areas of sort of exploration that I've been thinking about. And now that we have this kind of model, right? I think there are a lot of unknowns. I think there are a lot of question marks. What could we do with a globally cached CDN for everything that's on NPM? What kinds of opportunities does that open up for us?
Well, to some extent, I think it goes back to what you stated a little bit earlier, which was there is a bit of a black box nature when you start to talk about the notion of bundlers. And for a lot of developers who are not necessarily aware of what that thing generates across a set of project files or a set of libraries that have been included in something like that, you sort of end up with a problem that may not be easily resolved by an end developer who just hasn't experienced that yet. Every bundler works slightly differently. All of a sudden, you've got a project that includes some things that maybe it shouldn't, or in a certain way that the bundler doesn't understand. And now you have a problem where, as opposed to things like Unpkg, all of a sudden that problem to some extent goes away. Like, again, that nostalgia kicks in of, oh, I can just include these things and write some code, and I can just do something in my browser and not have to worry about the nature of this. Or I can learn and understand what the end result thing that I'm trying to accomplish is without having to understand this other somewhat black box complicated thing that's there, as opposed to something that I must immediately ship for production. Because there's obviously value within both contexts, right? It depends on what you're fundamentally trying to do. But Unpkg gives you quite a bit of features for authors and developers across the board of that nature, right? I don't have to worry about these things straight away. I can use them in a context locally, just as well as remotely in sort of a code sample sort of project that makes life a little bit easier for an end developer, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at this point, it's really, really struck a chord with those people who are, just developing sort of code samples and demos, because it really does simplify the mental model for them, right? I mean, Unpkg it's a 5-letter domain name, .com/your library name. So it's something that you can totally remember and just rattle off very, very easily if you're in one of those scenarios, right? Contrast that with, I think CodePen actually still has like some, like if you go into the settings dialog, it'll have like a select box, and then you can go down and you can sort of select the library that you want to include. Basically, if I'm building something like that, I have to have a way for somebody to get these other dependencies so that they don't have to write all of React before they can write their React CodePen, right? And if I can make it really, really easy for people to write script tags, then they don't need a select box to select their dependencies, right? If all the code is just published to npm anyway, they can just say unpkg.com/whatever and get whatever code they need right there on the page. So, it's kind of going back to, HTML used to crack open an HTML file and you would see, here's the JavaScript files that are involved here. Here's the CSS files that are involved. And Unpkg, I think, kind of takes us back to that world, but in a way that I think is, probably a lot more efficient than the way that we used to be, doing it. Obviously, you've got a globally cached network now, but it like I said, developers love it, or people who are doing in development, scale projects love it because it's just so easy to remember those URLs. I think the next, and I think there's something to be said for that, right? We don't have to sacrifice, development productivity all the time. I mean, Webpack, which was a huge step forward for our production web apps. Is there a way that we can preserve all of the stuff that we love about Webpack? The code splitting, the ability to use JavaScript modules, et cetera, in a way that, in a way that lets me declare things in HTML like I used to be able to do, right? Which this is actually one of the reasons why I love Parcel as a bundler. Which, if you haven't had Devin on the show, I'd be super interested to hear from him. He might be a good guest for y'all. But the one of the interesting things that Parcel does is it starts with HTML as the place where your entire app is sort of declared, right? As opposed to Webpack, where your entry point is a JavaScript file, right? What if we're just building HTML apps, right? HTML it's all going to be hosted in an HTML file eventually. In Webpack, HTML is sort of tacked on with they have an HTML Webpack plugin, which is a vital piece of that whole ecosystem. Well, in Parcel, you start with the HTML file. It's not tacked on later. It's not a plugin. It is the API, which is one of the reasons why I like it so much, because that was my API when I first got started doing web app development, 10 years ago. And so what if we could start with that API? Because I think that API was a great one, and get all of the stuff that we love about, modules and code splitting, et cetera, hot reloading, all of that stuff, but start it with a simpler API. I think, bundler configuration is still a huge hurdle for a lot of people who would like to be able to use a bundler, which is another thing that I like about Parcel is he said, this thing is zero config, right? We're going to take a different approach to bundling. We're still going to give you all the bells and whistles of the stuff that you like, the modules and the code splitting, et cetera. But HTML is our API, and we're not going to give you a ton of configuration. There's no loader API or something like that. So anyway, I think I think there's a lot to be said for the advances that we've made in bundling in the last couple of years. But I think there's also a lot to be said for keeping things as simple as we possibly can with a nice, simple mental model, which is one of the things that I love about Unpkg and one of the reasons that I built it, and something that I love about Parcel specifically as a bundler. I love the approach they're taking as well.
So Michael, I want to say thank you, by the way. I think we're on the same side of the political web spectrum here.
Okay.
But I agree with your concerns 100%. I personally have this love-hate relationship with bundlers as well. I love them as a developer, who wants to be productive and get things done fast. But I hate the fact that they make things so easy that it kind of stops and you don't have to think about your architecture as much or how much you're really sending across the wire to users,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so with, I know Google's been kind of pushing the purple pattern and, these modern bundling strategies, as well with the Webpack team, for having like, your common code, for example, something like React would be in a common bundler, a bundle that's more static, your code that might change week to week in a different bundle, so how did those kind of bundling strategies fit in with the Unpkg model, right? So if I was interested in using Unpkg in production, would I have like 5 or 6 links for, my core libraries that are fairly static? And then, I guess, how would you recommend? I mean, what does that look like?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I was actually, believe it or not, I was actually just talking to Sean Larkin the other day about this. There's a I think it's an ASP.NET Unpkg plugin for Visual Studio Code. So Sean works at Microsoft, and there was a plugin that another developer had made that basically let them, load things from Unpkg into their production apps. And the thread was a little contentious there on GitHub because, obviously the best practice nowadays is to use Webpack. It absolutely is, right? For reasons that we've mentioned. It is the best tool out there right now. That or something like Parcel is the best tool for actually, getting all of these benefits that we've been talking about. So I think, but I was talking to Sean about it, and I was like, wouldn't it be amazing if someday it wasn't, if someday that we moved beyond it, and when we did move beyond it, what would that look like? And I think Unpkg has a role to play there. I think, or could possibly have a role to play there. By the way, when I talk about Unpkg, it's not a commercial endeavor for me. It's a completely open source thing. I'm just trying to build a piece of infrastructure that I think could be useful for people. So when I'm promoting it and everything, I don't want people to think I'm like, trying to sell something. It's not. Cloudflare sponsors it and everything. But I think it could just be. It could be an interesting part of the sort of post Webpack story. I think if we've learned anything from web and from developing on the web and as developers in general, what's best practice today? How long does that actually last before somebody else comes along and new, the technology advances, we make another step and we see that it's not the best practice anymore. I think one of my favorite examples is React. I know that I've talked a lot about React on the podcast, so pardon me if you're not familiar with it, or for our listeners who aren't familiar with it, but the whole one of the things that React did when it was first released is or one of their, I guess, their kind of mottos that was put on them, by the way, by the community. They didn't come up with it themselves, but one of the things that they used to say is, we are rethinking best practices. And it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek way to say, the paradigm has shifted now. We have a different model for thinking about how we're doing updates to the DOM. It's declarative, it's functional. We've got a component model for managing state, etc. So all of the assumptions that we used to make about all of the best practices that we used to have, they all have question marks behind them now because things have changed fundamentally. So, for example, if I write div on click, to attach a click handler to a div element in the page. Well, we all know that it used to be bad practice, because what if you created a lot of them? Now you would have 1,000 listeners inside that on click thing. You used to you couldn't have any sort of encapsulation. You used to use globals. Well, now that we're using JavaScript modules to model components, and now that we have declarative updates to the DOM and a virtual DOM that can sort of optimize when that click listener is added. Is it really a terrible idea, right? And so in that same way, I'm thinking about Unpkg, right? I look at today's best practice and I acknowledge, yes, this is the best practice. But just the fact that Unpkg has resonated with the number of people that it has. I mean, we're doing almost 7 billion hits a month on the Unpkg CDN. If you've seen the website, it's not fancy. there are no ads on it. There's no like promotional use Unpkg. Da da da. This is, I think, the very first. I mean, I gave a talk about it last year at React Rally, but this is the first time anybody's actually interviewed me talking about it, and we're doing 7 billion requests a month. So it's obviously struck a chord with people. Okay, so what is that chord? And just knowing that best practices change every couple of years, it just kind of, I just kind of wonder if the best practice soon might be to use a global cache of stuff that's on NPM instead of everybody NPM installing stuff themselves and using a bundler to push it. I think for next steps, but this is all very theoretical, right? So next steps, very concrete next steps for Unpkg are providing a Webpack plugin. So we've actually got a Webpack plugin that is in the works. Given the fact that this podcast might not be published for a little while, it may actually be published by the time this podcast lands. We can maybe edit that out. I'm not sure, but anyway, we've actually got a Webpack plugin in the works that will let you require a file from Unpkg when you import it into your code. So it's actually in a very similar vein to this .NET ASP Unpkg plugin that I was talking about earlier. So basically, the idea is you can just import React, and when Webpack goes through and it's churning out your bundle, instead of taking all of React and putting it in your bundle or into another vendor bundle or whatever, it will just get React from the Unpkg CDN. And there are some things that I think are I think that's kind of a baby step forward, right? That basically lets you use your bundler of today with a global CDN. There are also some really cool things to experiment and play around with if you're using modules in the browser. So we've got, and this is something that I introduced a few months ago at React Rally, but we've got a module flag that you can put on anybody who's publishing ES modules to the NPM registry. So for example, the library that I demoed this with at React Rally was D3. So D3 publishes all ES modules to NPM. And so if you want to require one of those modules in your web project, if you're in a browser that understands ES modules and knows how to load ES modules, what you can do is stick a module query parameter on your request to Unpkg for the module, and it will dynamically translate all of the ES module imports into relative imports that will require those same files from the Unpkg CDN, which currently in the import spec there's no way to resolve global bear identifiers, right? So if I'm developing a web app that uses ES modules and I say import D3 from D3, right? Quotation mark D3 and close quotation mark, right? That is what we mean by a bear identifier. The browser is going to look at that and be like, sorry, buddy, I don't know. What do you mean by this D3 thing? Where do I even go and find this thing? So Unpkg actually has a potential answer for this. You could say import D3 from unpkg.com/D3 query string module. And when you go and fetch that file from D3, again, in a browser that understands ES modules, Unpkg will dynamically translate all of those import statements on the fly, to import statements that will require from Unpkg again. So you will have, the whole waterfall of requests is going to happen, transparently. So again, really great for building demos, not so great for building production apps, because if you're going to require all of D3 module by module, you're going to end up with something like, 500 or 600 requests. But I think it's an interesting capability, an interesting thing that we can do, right? And so the question becomes, okay, so how do you optimize that? Could we return the whole thing in one request? Could we use something like a service worker on the client to cache a lot of those requests for you, and then only request the files that are changing. But again, this is more sort of forward future thinking stuff. But something that you can use today is you could just say, instead of publishing our own bundle with React in it, we could just use the Unpkg Webpack plugin, and we could get React from the Unpkg CDN instead.
That's really great to hear that you have all that. You've thought out kind of the full tree of dependencies in that way, and that folks are able to continue leveraging Unpkg, throughout their full dependency tree. That's really great. So before we're almost out of time, but I wanted to just touch on what the workflow would be like for authors and using Unpkg. So you mentioned that there's some flags that they can use. I guess could you just kind of walk us through how if at all the workflow is different than publishing to NPM?
Yeah, absolutely. So the workflow, and I'll try and keep this short. The workflow today for using Unpkg, we've got on unpkg.com, I've got like a little blurb at the bottom that gives you the suggested workflow. So right now, today, for the most people, we suggest that you just build to a UMD bundle that exports a global, and then whoever wants your library can just use unpkg.com/your library, and then they can get it on the page. If you do not specify that, if you do not point to that UMD bundle in your main entry in your package JSON, you could use a special unpackage entry in your package JSON that points to that UMD bundle, and then people will be able to use your library by just saying unpkg.com/your library, and they will get the latest version of your library. Also, they could put unpkg.com/your library at a specific version and get that specific version of your library. So that's kind of the suggested workflow for today. But for people who are thinking about the future of publishing JavaScript, I think the future is definitely going to be ES modules. So I would encourage people to think about, what does it look like? I mean, both for using bundlers and for using a CDN, right? Because bundlers are even starting to understand ES modules these days as well. So if you're publishing JavaScript and you want to share it, I would definitely take a long, hard look at publishing ES modules. And it's not going to be a one-to-one mapping with whatever you're publishing today, in your CommonJS build, which is probably what you're publishing if you're publishing to NPM. Your CommonJS build was built for a slightly different world than what we've got here in the ES modules. And there are a couple of things that you can do with ES modules that just a couple of the semantics are different, right? For example, you have named exports and, the default export, are concepts in ES modules that kind of map one-to-one to CommonJS modules, but there are a couple of things that are kind of different as well. So anyway, I would encourage people who are thinking about the future of this stuff. So what I do, honestly, with all of my JavaScript libraries is I publish a few different builds to NPM to let people consume my code however they want. So usually what I've got, and you can look at any of my libraries to see exactly how I'm doing it. Either React Router or the history library are great examples. I'm actually publishing CommonJS, and I'll publish ESM or ECMAScript modules, ES modules, and then I'll also publish a UMD build. And I think I'm probably going to do that for the next, just for the next little while, at least for the next year or two, until it becomes very, very clear that a lot of people are using ES modules, that ES modules are really, really catching on. And even then I might still publish, the other things like, the CommonJS modules and the UMD builds for people who, have legacy apps and workflows or whatever. But I think definitely the future is ES modules. So if you're not publishing those today, I would encourage you to take a look at that and think about how you might be able to take advantage of them best in the package that you're working on.
That's pretty neat. So you're very, I would say, very considerate, by the way, to wait that long. I would just use ES modules now because really, we're we're kind of like we're holding the web back a little bit, right, by not adopting it, especially since browser metrics, people count these stuff. They count like how many people are using new features, and by adopting newer standards, these aren't just fads, right? This is an actual standard. We're able to validate the standard a bit more, potentially push it further, and then also I think for people that are not ready to adopt that, they can be these kind of like USB to USB-C dongles.
That's exactly what they are. We're building dongles. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. They can use a dongle, and I think the usage of that dongle makes it very loud and clear to them, their product owners, their management team, that we need to dedicate some time to move our platform forward. But that's just my highly opinionated opinion.
No, so. I appreciate that. I think a lot of my here's the thing. I sympathize with you. I think you're absolutely right. I just don't know what I don't know what a JavaScript module dongle looks like yet.
Right. I mean, either, and I think that people need to make those packages to help bridge folks. But I think it's like in general, like NPM authors, should they be publishing their libraries in ES5, right? At this point, as long as it's real ES6, right? Not this sugar ES6 of all these stage 1, 2 features. If it's real JavaScript, you should just publish it, and then the consumer of that module should be responsible for, incorporating that into their application, right? And so,
I totally agree with you. Also, my opinion has been a little bit, I guess maybe the reason I'm a little bit more conservative here is just because of some of the backlash that I've gotten because of the stuff I've worked on. If I personally were to take an approach like that in a React router situation, I mean, that's a library that really is, it's downloaded 4 million times a month. People would probably put my head on a pike, and and they would be very angry at me. I mean, I agree. I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Because my heart is with you, but then my GitHub issues would be very, very angry. So I have to learn to kind of manage both of these things. And I think, I'm still doing things on Unpkg, like undocumented stuff that I did back in the early days that I've decided are not a good idea anymore and would actually be harmful. But I know people built stuff with it, right? So I'll keep this thing on just so that anybody's using this whole thing. But I'm not documenting it. I'm not recommending it or anything. So yeah.
And for me, that this problem is very easily solved with semantic versioning, right? And this kind of obsession that we have as a community to be on the latest version of all the things all of the time is just insane, And so you're not ready to go to the next version of this thing because you have some tech that you need to fix before that, and that's okay. But you're absolutely right. I don't have a library that has 4 million downloads a month. You do, so it's really easy for me to say that.
Angry at you, Amal. It's crazy. You're like, oh no, I know for free, and they're like, I'll teach you to give me this code for free, and you're like, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, actually, so I've met Ryan, your partner, in person, and him and I gave a talk at the React meetup at the same night. He was in Boston, and he spoke at our local meetup. And basically, Ryan told us all about the flogging that you guys get, every time you change something, even though it's semantically versioned and it's optional upgrades, and but people get angry, and that's a failure on us as a community. We need to educate developers around the fact that open source is most of the time, unfortunately, unpaid and volunteer work.
You've given me some new courage here. Actually, I think I may just go ahead and because now I know that there are people like you out there who feel this way, and I thought I was the only one. So I think we're on the same page.
Yeah. Anyways, well, again, it's been an absolute pleasure having you. Was there anything that we missed that you wanted to discuss today before we wrap?
No, we pretty much wrapped it up. You can maybe just a couple of places that you can follow me, the work that I do. I'm M Jackson pretty much anywhere you go on Twitter, GitHub, or NPM, or anywhere else. And then I've also got an Unpkg Twitter account. So Unpkg is not spelled like you might think; it's Unpkg. But we've also got a Twitter account where we do our best to respond to issues and things as they arise. And then also unpkg.com and github.com/unpkg is where we do all of our development. So yeah, I'd love to, we're always looking for contributors and people who are interested in working on this stuff. And I think the only requirement is that you got an open mind and you're willing to, question the status quo and think about what could this stuff look like in the future.
Be willing to, not scream back at open source, users.
Yeah, don't put the frowny face on my GitHub issue comment. Come on, give me a laughing face if you think I'm being dumb. Not the frowny face.
No. Anyways, well, thank you so much, Justin. Do you want to take us out?
Sure. This has been episode number 161 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we've been speaking with Michael Jackson, talking about Unpkg, talking about JS modules, talking about all things that are coming up for the web and just how to make your developer life easier. Tune in next week when we talk more things web, more things developer friendliness, and all things that you'll probably want to keep an eye on as the web moves forward. We've been your hosts this week, Danny Blue, Amal Hussein, and Justin Ribeiro. Have a wonderful rest of your week.